As a boy, I lived in Washington, D.C. on a dead-end street that abuts Rock Creek Park. The creek itself is about a mile walk from my house. As a result, all kinds of insects and creepy crawlies invades the neighborhood. Stink bugs, mosquitoes, all kinds of bees, spiders, and other bugs I had no idea what they were. Then there were the harvestmen, or Granddaddy Longlegs. Up until very recently, I thought it was the daddy long-legged spider because it had long black legs. The typical daddy long-legged spider comes from Europe, and there are 150 different kinds of species. The harvestmen, on the other hand, belong to a category of non-spider arachnids, which include ticks, mites, and scorpions. They are called harvestmen because they are usually seen during harvest time, between the months of July and November. Unlike spiders who have 8 eyes, harvestmen have 2 eyes and fang-like mouths. And unlike spiders, they cannot produce silk, so they cannot make webs. Though they eat insects, spiders, and plants, they are neither poisonous nor venomous. I would basically see them around houses and trees, and my house is where I saw them and captured them. As a mean and nasty pastime, I used to pull the legs from the Granddaddy's long legs and push its body so I could watch it roll around on the windowsill. According to the literature, these kinds of arachnids will discharge its legs whenever it's threatened, but their legs won't grow back. Scientists have concluded that they do not feel pain when their legs discharged. I pulled all of its legs. Then eventually, after I had tired of watching its body roll back and forth on the windowsill, into the trash it went. It was a sick and sadistic thing to do. I was a boy, and I did cruel things to things smaller than me, basically insects. I don't know if it was curiosity or a thrill or that rush of power, or maybe all three. I'll never forget one in particular. After I happily pulled out all of his legs and rolled its body around, I stared at its eyes. As I stared into its eyes, I swear it had the look of not just anger, not just contempt, but revenge. I had never seen that of an insect before, let alone an arachnid. A lot of times it had that dull, what the hell just happened look. Most things don't scream, so you don't know what level of pain they experience. But this one, this Granddaddy, had the look of intense hatred, fierce animosity. Like if it could get me back, it would, 10 times over. As customary, I tossed its body in the trash can and eventually forgot all about it. I went about my days going to school and doing my usual playtime mixed with whatever mischievousness I decided to get into. Down in the creek with the other neighborhood kids, eating mud pies, skipping rocks across the water, taking those same rocks and aiming them at insects, birds, frogs, and other living things in the creek, falling in the creek and then swimming in it, capturing salamanders, then taking them home, which meant they would die in 2 weeks because they were in the wrong water and weren't fed correctly. On most nights, I pretended I was asleep when my parents checked on me, but I was reading my comic books with a flashlight. Even then, I didn't notice a pair of black legs lifting up the window. Suddenly, I stood up and saw this huge orange body with piercing black eyes and these terrifying long 8 black legs. Before I could scream, the arachnid swung one of its legs and knocked me down. With another leg, he covered my mouth. I couldn't scream to my parents. They were asleep with no idea that a giant arachnid would soon knock me unconscious and take me away and most likely make me its meal. I could see the spider lower its head and stare at me with those eyes of revenge I saw a few days before. It was as if it said, "You're all mine now." Before I could manage any pleading noises, it raised the leg that knocked me down before and swung it again, knocking me out. It lifted me up with its legs and crawled out of my bedroom window. As I came to, I felt the blowing of the wind and saw the swiftness of trees going by. The summer air was cool, but I was pinned to its body and held by 2 of its legs. The Granddaddy carried me effortlessly as it ran steadfastly through Rock Creek Park. It stopped momentarily, waiting for the road to clear of cars before crossing toward the creek. Then it jumped over the creek to the other side and kept its pace through the woods. We seemed to be traveling pretty fast, maybe even 20 to 30 miles an hour. The Granddaddy was highly adept at navigating through the woods. After what seemed about an hour, it brought me to a whole cluster of stones. It was familiar to me. I recognized it. It was the Capitol stones, stones from the U.S. Capitol building that was renovated in 1958. Apparently, the builders took all the leftover stones and dumped them here. I usually hung with the neighborhood kids during our excursions down to the creek, but sometimes I went on hikes in Rock Creek Park by myself. One spring day, I hiked up north to the Rock Creek Park Horse Center. From there, I just got lost, but stumbled upon these stones. There were a series of rock piles. They were really cool to explore, some of which were perfectly cut. There were others that had inscriptions carved in them. It was clear there was a lot of history. I learned that the U.S. Capitol was first constructed in 1793, so some of those stones could have dated back as far as colonial times. There were a few places underneath the stones that were completely dark. I was by myself, so I would not dare try to wiggle my way inside. Besides, who knows what lurked underneath? It started getting late, and I was pretty scared because I didn't know where I was. I was only 10 years old at the time. I didn't want to keep walking and end up walking through the woods at night. Fortunately, a pair of college students were kind enough to lead me back to the horse center, and I was on my way back home. It was underneath one of those piles this Granddaddy managed to dig below and create a dark cavernous space underneath. No matter how many people stopped to explore those stones, I highly doubt anyone would be so adventurous as to climb down such a dark and scary hole that would lead to such a treacherous unknown. Besides, what if the stones collapsed? Anyone underneath would be trapped. The arachnid put me in a corner of the space. Again, it stared at me with those hateful, piercing eyes. Then with its legs, it tossed me back and forth as if it were playing with me. I screamed with all my might. It didn't matter. No one could hear me. There were no patrols here. It was deep in the forest in the middle of the night. It seemed to take delight in my terror. I suddenly understood. It was doing to me what I did to it a few nights ago, and what I have been doing to its kind for a while now. Does that mean it will pull my arms and legs out and play with my torso until I die a long, agonizing death, then throw me into a trash can, or perhaps just leave me there in this dark, cavernous space to be eaten by all the vermin inside? A creature like this wouldn't understand that I'm just a boy, and boys do boyish things, and sometimes we are cruel, but eventually we will grow out of it and be more humane to living things. They only know survival and to defend themselves from all kinds of predators while they prey upon smaller life forms for food to sustain their lives. They only know that some creature is pulling their legs apart, rendering them helpless, and then casting them into a trash can to die an ugly death. This particular Granddaddy was given an opportunity of a lifetime, and it was not going to squander it by merely getting away. It was going to exact revenge on its perpetrator. It was going to do me what was done to it. In its short life, there is no gray area, only black and white. After a while, it stopped playing with me and abruptly left, probably to dine on prey more substantial than it was used to dining on. Rats, mice, squirrels, chipmunks, frogs perhaps. It was pitch black, so I could not see any carcasses on the ground floor, though I imagined there were. It seemed for a couple of hours that the arachnid roamed the long and extensive park. There was nothing I could do in the meantime. I seemed to be stuck against its corner. I was terrified beyond belief. It was clear I was to die here, and no one would know until my body started to stink, and even then, there was no guarantee that anyone would investigate. Dead animals would have a similar stench. My eyes adjusted enough to see shadows. Tears were streaming down my face as I watched and listened to the insects crawling around the ground floor, the leaves giving a high, crinkling sound. From the time I was abducted to when I was ping-ponging around by the Granddaddy, I had pissed my pants a few times, and the itching of my thighs became unbearable. Then I heard the sound of the Granddaddy's legs pound, patter, and spread into this cavernous space. It was followed by a thud against the same wall against which I was stuck. I heard some loud cries, and I realized that it had another victim. Who could this be? His voice sounded familiar. It was one of the neighborhood kids. In fact, it was Dan, the one who showed me all about pulling the Granddaddy's legs apart and rolling its body around. My terror increased exponentially. Now I knew it was going to kill both of us, painfully and slowly, like we had done so many times before to its kind. We were doomed in the worst way. Like me, it tossed Dan back and forth, causing him to sob uncontrollably. After what seemed like minutes, it stopped. The pause was staggering. There was a ringing in my ears like I never experienced before. This was it. Our fate was sealed. It was about to happen. Then I heard the Granddaddy's leg tap the ground back and forth. It sounded like a pattern. I was shocked. It sounded like, "Eeny, meeny, miny, moe, catch the tiger by the toe. If it hollers, let him go. Eeny, meeny, miny, moe." How the hell did he know that game? Only humans knew that game. No other living creature could play that game unless it was me. I did it to this Granddaddy. Each time before I pulled a leg, I said, "Eeny, meeny, miny, moe." But instead of saying tiger, I said spider. This, of course, before I knew it was not a spider, which drew out the time each leg would be pulled. It remembered that song and what I did to it. It reminded me of the pleasure that I took in it. This time, it was playing the game as to which one of us it was going to kill first. The 16-beat rhyme ended with the last leg pounding in front of Dan. The Granddaddy seemed to rear its head as if to laugh. It was an ugly, shrieking sound. Dan screamed at the top of his lungs and tried mightily to fight it off, but he was pinned down by its legs. With one leg, it sounded out, "Eeny, meeny, miny, moe" again, but even slower than the first time. When it stopped on one limb, it began pulling. Slowly. Dan frantically squirmed as much as he could as a blood-curdling scream came from his mouth. I could hear the tendons ripping apart, the bone horribly cracking and breaking, and the limb finally snapping and separating from the body. By the time the Granddaddy snapped the second limb from Dan's body, Dan became quiet. Then the arachnid did the same eeny, meeny, miny, moe pattern to pick the second limb it was going to pull. By the time the Granddaddy snapped the second limb from Dan's body, Dan became quiet. He had passed out from the pain. The last two limbs were pulled apart without the song, with the recognition by the Granddaddy that Dan was not conscious, so he could not be terrorized as he was before. After the Granddaddy was done pulling all of Dan's limbs, it shrieked with joy once again. It began rolling Dan's torso back and forth repeatedly. After a time, it stopped. Another long, horrible pause before it backed away and out of the dark, cavernous space. I had to sit another 2 hours in the dark, seeing the shadows of Dan's limbs near the wall where I sat and his torso across the way. I could smell the stench of the blood as I imagined it pooling across the ground floor. I screamed his name as loud as I could. I could hear a very faint voice saying, "Help me, help me." Then after a while, nothing. He was dead. He had to be. No adult, let alone a child, could survive that kind of torture. And with no immediate medical assistance, he was gone for sure. Then, after a while, nothing. He was dead. He had to be. I couldn't hear his breath anymore. No adult, let alone a child, could survive that kind of torture, and with no immediate medical assistance, he was gone for sure. Then it was my turn. I saw and heard the Granddaddy's legs pound, patter, and spread into this dark, cavernous space. It was coming directly for me. It wanted to hear me scream like Dan. I too tried to fight, but I was pinned down. As it began its deathly eeny, meeny, miny, mo, I decided to do something that I would never in a million years contemplate. I did not want to experience the excruciating pain that Dan felt while being conscious. The only way to avoid it was to make sure I was unconscious. So I lifted my head as high as I could and slammed it against the wall. The Granddaddy was so preoccupied with playing the game, it didn't notice what I was trying to do. The third time was the charm. I blacked out. When I came to, I saw the daylight coming through the opening of the dark, cavernous space. I could tell it was bright and sunny outside. I was hearing the beautiful sounds of the birds chirping and a faint rustle of the leaves on the trees. Suddenly I heard thudding footsteps coming closer. I mustered all of my strength to scream, "Help me! Help me! Help me!" Just like Dan did hours ago. The footsteps hastened. "Hello?" I screamed again, "Help me!" Someone said, "Oh my God, it sounds like a kid. Give me a flashlight." I saw what looked like black boots followed by green pants work their way down the opening. I saw the flashlight canvassing the space. "Oh my God," he screamed. I saw what he saw. Dan's limbs strewn about, his head and torso against the far wall, bled out. I could see now that it was a park ranger that came down. As soon as he saw the scene, he got on his walkie. "I'm at the Capitol Stones. I've got one dead kid and another one seriously hurt. I need 2 ambulances and police backup right now." He turned to face me. "Don't worry, kid. Help is on the way." I looked down around me, and miraculously my arms and legs were still intact. I could barely move, however, because of the beating I took from the Granddaddy, plus knocking myself out. I sobbed uncontrollably. I was spared. But why? It had to be because it couldn't wake me up to torture me, and I was out so long and decided to wait until the following night. It didn't account for someone actually finding me. What luck for me, and dumb luck for the Granddaddy. I guess one consolation for it was that he had one victim. Dan was literally destroyed. I cannot imagine what it's going to be like for his parents to see him like this. My parents came to see me in the hospital. My mother tried to hold it together, but then she almost fell to pieces when she saw me. My dad had to take her out of my room. Since it was a mystery what happened to Dan and me, there were 2 policemen guarding my door, just in case the killer tried to come back. I tried to tell them that it was a huge Granddaddy that attacked us, but they chalked it up to me being delirious. I was in the intensive care unit for a couple of days. Now I'm in the step-down unit. A few more days and I should be able to go home. So, I'm sitting here thinking back to how it was possible that the Granddaddy could not only miraculously grow its legs back, but to grow the size of a 7-foot large human. What was in that trash can that I threw its body into that could cause this? What I am realizing, and what I believe, is that there was a 9-volt battery I threw away, which most likely ended up next to the Granddaddy's body. Usually, I would place the contacts against my tongue to make sure that it worked. If I felt a little charge, it was good to go. When it didn't, I thought it was dead, so I threw it away. But this one had enough charge to activate the body of the Granddaddy. The charge, in combination with the rage inside that arachnid, gave it the energy it needed to grow its legs back. But it did more than that. It actually grew. It grew inside that trash bag until it was about to rip it open and climb out of the trash can, and it was headed directly for me. It looked up my bedroom window and began making its ascent. I know it sounds far-fetched, but it is the only explanation I have. We didn't have any hazardous waste in the trash can, and unless there were some chemicals in that trash can I didn't know about, that had to have been it. Still, could a simple battery do all of that? I don't know, and I can't scratch my head enough in wonder. I cannot believe I'm alive like this. I'm trying to sleep, but the pain from the beating keeps me up. I'm about to press a button so that the nurses on staff can come into my room to give me more pain medication, but now I suddenly feel a great tightening of my entire body. I am able to look down and see 8 large black legs squeezing me as I am pinned to the bed. I go to scream, but one of its legs is covering my mouth. I cannot see, for its body is underneath my bed. I feel the incredible agony as my ribs are being crushed, blood squirting out of my mouth. I'm feeling like I'm fading in and out of consciousness. The pain as excruciating, I imagine, as Dan's when his limbs were being torn from his body. One could say that the Granddaddy is the gentlest of all these 8-legged arachnids. It's not poisonous or venomous, and even with its fangs, it doesn't bite humans. It feeds on insects that are pests to us. They prefer the dark, so they don't stick around us very long. It's the most vulnerable and the easiest to catch, and I picked off every single one I could find and gave each one a cruel death. At this moment, I realize that I am like Cruel Frederick, a boy in a collection of German children's stories. Cruel Frederick was mean toward any living thing smaller than him. He killed birds, threw kittens down the stairs, and picked the wings off flies. Cruel Frederick had a dog whom he beat terribly. One day, his dog turned on him. Sick and beaten up, the boy had to lie in bed to recover, and the dog got its revenge by eating Cruel Frederick's dinner at the table. And here I am, losing my life, painfully and slowly, as Granddaddy is poking its legs deep into my torso and pulling out pieces of my organs and bringing them to its mouth underneath me. As I am biting its leg and screaming with all the breath that I have left, I hear the slurping sounds. I am delirious, undergoing a cruel and unsympathetic death. I am the dish best served.